The lottery notice arrived on a Tuesday, which Ruth Adeyemi would later describe as the least dramatic possible day for the end of everything she knew. She had been grading papers, Year 6, a unit on African geography, 31 essays of varying quality spread across her kitchen table, when the government seal appeared on her tablet screen, pulsing amber in the way that meant the message had been encrypted, verified, and witnessed by no fewer than 3 independent AI observers. She almost dismissed it. She received encrypted government communications perhaps twice a year, usually about pension adjustments or solar grid billing disputes. She set down her red pen, tapped the seal, and read. By the time she reached the 3rd paragraph, her tea had gone cold. By the 5th, she had knocked it off the table entirely and was standing in her kitchen in Lagos, 67 years old, in her house dress and reading glasses, staring at the words Earth's selected representative to the Galactic Union proceedings and feeling the particular, specific horror of a woman who has always believed, in some quiet corner of herself, that the universe will eventually ask too much of her. The lottery had been running for 11 days. Every adult human being on Earth, 8.4 billion of them, had been entered automatically by virtue of citizenship. The odds of selection were roughly 1 in 8 billion. Ruth had never won anything. Not the neighborhood raffle, not the school prize draw she'd entered every year for 20 years on behalf of her students. Once she had found 20 naira on the street outside a market stall and spent it on a mango, and that had been the apex of her luck until this moment, when the universe apparently decided to compensate for everything at once. She called her daughter first. Adiz answered on the 2nd ring, already half knowing something was wrong. Mothers and daughters share a frequency that transcends ordinary communication, and listened in silence as Ruth read the notice aloud, her voice steady in the way it became when she was most frightened, which was a quality her students had always mistaken for authority. "Mama," Adiz said, when the reading was done. "I know," Ruth said. "You have to go. I know that too." There was a pause in which a great many things were communicated between them without words. The knowledge that refusing would mean forfeiting Earth's right to representation at all, which the notice had made clear. The understanding that Ruth was, in some sense, the right person, even if she was also absolutely the wrong one, and the grief of 2 women who had always known the world asked more of certain people than of others, and had made their peace with it, and found that making peace did not make it hurt less. "I'll come over," Adiz said. "Bring the children," Ruth said. "I want to see their faces before I go." The briefings lasted 48 hours and left Ruth with a headache that settled behind her left eye like a small, persistent animal that had decided to live there. Teams of diplomats, xenolinguists, legal scholars, and trauma specialists cycled through her assigned quarters in the government facility outside Abuja, each carrying tablets loaded with documents she would never have time to read, each wearing the expression of people who had trained their entire lives for a moment that was now being handed to a retired schoolteacher from Lagos who kept asking where the bathroom was. She learned the charges in detail. The Corvin Corporation had strip-mined 3 moons in the Velan system between 2089 and 2094, extracting rare earth compounds essential to human faster-than-light drives and leaving behind geological scars visible from planetary orbit. The moons had been inhabited, not by sapient life, the corporation had argued, though the Velan themselves contested this strenuously, but by complex ecosystems that had evolved over millions of years and no longer existed. In 2101, the EDF frigate Resolute had opened fire on a Drelian observation vessel in disputed space, claiming sensor malfunction. In 2108, the same claim was made by a different captain in a different sector, and the galaxy's patience with human sensor malfunctions had reached its limit. And then there was the Keth incident, a human biological research station on the Outer Rim, a pathogen engineered for terraforming purposes, a containment failure that had taken 6 years and half the Keth's population of one continent before it burned itself out. The scientists responsible had meant no harm. They never did. Ruth listened to all of it. She asked questions that surprised the briefers, not the political or strategic questions they'd anticipated, but practical ones. Many Keth had died? What had happened to the scientists afterward? Did the Velan have a word for what the moons had meant to them? The briefers answered what they could and looked uncomfortable at what they couldn't, which told her more than their answers did. On the 2nd morning, a young diplomat named Femi, 28 years old, clearly brilliant, clearly terrified on her behalf, sat across from her and said, with the directness of someone who had run out of diplomatic language, "Mrs. Adeyemi, I have to be honest with you. The prosecution's case is strong. Stronger than anything we've seen before the Union. The vote is expected to be close, but the current modeling suggests expulsion is the probable outcome." "What happens then?" Ruth asked. If we're expelled. Femi hesitated. Trade exclusion. Navigation rights revoked. We'd be confined to our own solar system, effectively. No faster-than-light transit privileges. No interstellar communication through Union channels. He paused. Within 2 generations, the technological gap between humanity and the rest of the Union would be unsurvivable. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What do they want me to say?" "We've prepared a statement." "I didn't ask what you'd prepared. I asked what they want to hear. From me. A human being standing in front of them." She watched him struggle. "Tell me the truth, Femi. I spent 32 years teaching children. I always knew when someone was reading from a script." He set down his tablet. "They want to know," he said, slowly, "whether we understand what we've done. Whether we actually, fundamentally, understand it. Not legally. Not diplomatically. Whether it has landed in us the way it landed in them." Ruth nodded. She picked up her tea. They had given her very good tea, she would give them that, and looked out the window at the compound's small garden, where a bougainvillea was doing its stubborn, vivid best against a concrete wall. "All right," she said. "Then that's what I'll tell them." The journey took 4 days by human reckoning, though the ship's AI explained that this figure was a translation convenience and the actual transit involved geometries for which human language had no good nouns. Ruth spent the first day nauseated, the second day sleeping, and the third and fourth days sitting in the observation lounge watching space do things she had no framework to understand, which she found, unexpectedly, peaceful. There was a quality to ignorance, the genuine kind, the kind where you know you don't know and have stopped pretending otherwise, that she had always found restful. It was the pretending that exhausted people. She had learned this in classrooms. The ship's AI, who had a voice like warm wood and introduced itself as Chorus, was patient with her questions and honest about the ones it couldn't answer. She asked about the Galactic Union's history. She asked about the species who would be voting. She asked whether any of them had ever done things as bad as the things humanity had done, and Chorus paused for 3 full seconds, which, for an AI, is an eternity, before saying that the historical record was complex and that she might benefit from understanding the Drevathi expansion of 3400 BCE, the Solini Water Wars, and the near-extinction event that the Keth themselves had caused in the Palavar system 17,000 years ago, all of which were in the record and none of which humanity had been told about during the briefings. "Why wasn't I briefed on those?" Ruth asked. "Your diplomatic team's strategy was to focus on defense and mitigation," Chorus said. "Historical parallels were deemed potentially inflammatory." "Potentially embarrassing," Ruth said. "Yes," Chorus said. She asked Chorus to tell her everything. It took most of the 4th day. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bunk in the dark, 67 years old, 4 days from home, and let the weight of it settle on her. Not the strategy, not the arguments, not the points she might make or deflect or counter, but simply the weight of being human and having done human things in a galaxy that was watching, and having to stand up and be the one who answered for it. She thought about her students. The ones who had cheated on tests and come to her afterward, not because they'd been caught but because the guilt had become too heavy to carry alone. She had never shamed them. She had sat with them and asked them to tell her, in their own words, what they understood about what they'd done. Not to punish them, because understanding was the only thing that changed anything. The punishment was just noise. She thought about that for a long time. Then she closed her eyes and slept 4 hours, which was more than she'd expected. The chamber of the Galactic Union was not what she'd expected, which she supposed was inevitable. Human imaginations had been constructing alien meeting halls for 300 years, and all of them had been wrong in the same ways, projecting grandeur, geometry, the aesthetics of authority as humanity understood it. The actual chamber was, she searched for the word, standing in the corridor outside, breathing through her mouth because the air carried a smell she had no reference for, something between stone and electricity, and a third thing that she suspected was not a smell at all, but a perception from a sense she didn't have. Intimate. That was the word. It was intimate in scale. The ceiling was not far above her head. The room was roughly circular, roughly 200 meters across, roughly, because the walls did not quite hold still, a phenomenon Chorus had warned her about and which she was still not prepared for. The seating was arranged in concentric tiers, and in those tiers sat representatives of 112 species, and the sound they collectively produced was not noise but a kind of textured silence, each species contributing its own ambient frequency to a composition that somehow resolved into quiet. There were 400 million people watching on Earth. She had been told this number and found that it meant nothing to her in any useful way, so she had set it aside. There were also approximately 11 billion other beings watching through Union broadcast channels, across 40 star systems, which meant even less. What she could see were the beings in front of her, the Velan delegation, whose 3 members had the quality of standing water and watched her with compound eyes that caught the light from every angle, the Keth ambassador, who was the same height as a 12-year-old child and sat very still and had not looked at her yet, the Drelian representatives, tall and gray and patient in the way of creatures who had measured time in geological epochs before humanity had learned to count, and the many others, the species she had no names for despite Chorus's briefings, the ones whose forms her eyes kept sliding off because there was something in their presence that her visual cortex filed under peripheral and could not update. The chief adjudicator was a being called, in the translation provided to Ruth, the speaker of accumulated questions. This was apparently a title of great honor among its kind, the Arvathi, who communicated primarily in structured silence and for whom the act of asking a question was a form of profound trust. It addressed her first, and the translation came through her earpiece as a voice that sounded inexplicably like her secondary school headmistress, which she chose to interpret as a mercy. "Ruth Adeyemi of Earth," the speaker said. "You stand before the Galactic Union as the selected voice of your species. You are here because your world has been charged with acts that caused material, ecological, and mortal harm to member civilizations of this body. You have 72 hours, by your calendar, in which this chamber will hear your world's response. Do you understand the terms of this proceeding?" "I do," Ruth said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Do you accept the factual record as presented by the Union's prosecution?" There was a beat. The briefing team had told her to deflect on this question, to request the opportunity to examine specific claims, to introduce procedural considerations that would buy time and space for nuance. "Yes," Ruth said. "I accept the factual record." Something moved through the chamber. She couldn't have said what it was, a shift in the textured silence, a collective adjustment, some interspecies equivalent of drawing breath. "Then you may begin," the speaker said. She had notes. She had 300 pages of notes, prepared by the diplomatic team, organized by topic and annotated with legal precedents and cross-referenced with Union Charter articles. She had a prepared opening statement that 7 people had spent 40 hours crafting, and that was, she had to admit, very well written. She reached into the folder she was carrying, a physical folder, because she thought better with paper, and set it on the lectern in front of her, and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at the chamber. The Keth ambassador had still not looked at her. "I'm going to be honest with you," Ruth said, without the statement. "That's what I can offer. I don't know if it's enough, and I want to be clear from the beginning that I'm not here to tell you it is." She paused. The translation lag was 0.8 seconds, Chorus had told her. She was already learning to speak in that rhythm. "I am a retired primary school teacher. I taught children between the ages of 5 and 12 for 32 years in Lagos, Nigeria, on the continent of Africa, on the planet Earth. I have never left my solar system before this week. I was selected by lottery. I am not a politician or a diplomat or a lawyer, and I want you to know that before I say anything else, because what I am going to say to you is the truth as I understand it, and not the truth as someone who had a strategy would understand it." Another movement through the chamber. One of the Velan tilted its head, a gesture Chorus had described as indicating attention, the sharpened kind, the kind given to something unexpected. "The things in the record happened," Ruth said. 3 moons were destroyed. 2 ships were fired on by our military. A biological experiment killed many of your people. She looked at the Keth ambassador as she said the last part. He had not moved. "I have read the record. I have also read the things that were not in the materials my diplomatic team prepared for me, the historical record of other species' acts, other failures, other moments where a civilization did something that could not be undone. I want you to know that I read those things not to use them against you, but because I needed to understand whether what I'm about to tell you is specific to humanity or whether it is something older and harder than that." She stopped. She thought about what she'd understood, lying in that bunk 4 nights ago. "Humanity is young," she said. "I know that's not an excuse. I've heard it offered as one, and it isn't one, and I won't offer it that way. But it is a fact that I think is relevant to what I'm going to tell you. We are a very young species. We have been leaving our solar system for less than 200 years. We arrived in this galaxy with the habits of creatures who had spent most of their existence in scarcity, competing for resources, moving fast, treating the unknown as something to be taken rather than understood. We brought those habits with us. We did not always know we had them. We did not always understand that what felt like normal behavior to us was, to everyone else, something between recklessness and violence. She paused again. Some of us knew. I want to be honest about that too. Some of us knew, and were not listened to, and that is one of our oldest failures, the way we treat the people in our own civilization who see the harm coming and say so. We have always been better at building than at listening. I'm not proud of that. The Drelian representative, the tallest one on the far left of the tier, turned its face slightly toward her. Chorus had explained that the Drelian communicated approval through orientation, that to face a thing was to acknowledge its weight. Ruth took a breath. I have something I want to say specifically about the Keth. And I want to say it to the ambassador directly, if he's willing. She looked at the Keth ambassador. He was small and still and had not looked at her for the entire time she'd been speaking. Around him, the other members of his delegation, there were 5 of them, had the quality of people holding something fragile. Ambassador, Ruth said, I understand if you don't want to hear from me. I understand if there is nothing I can say that has any value to you. I'm going to say it anyway, because I think not saying it would be a kind of additional harm, and I've made enough of those today just by standing here and breathing the same air as you. The ambassador did not respond. But he had not moved away. The scientists who released that pathogen did not intend to kill your people, Ruth said. I know that doesn't help. I know it might make it worse. But I have spent 32 years watching human beings cause harm to each other through carelessness, through speed, through the assumption that because they could not imagine the worst outcome, it wouldn't happen. I have watched children break things and then look at the broken thing with genuine shock, as if reality had failed to comply with their intentions. We do not stop being capable of that as adults. We should. We don't. Her voice had not wavered yet. She found that it was easier to speak the truth than she had thought. Not because the truth was easy, but because the difficulty of it felt appropriate, felt like the correct weight for what she was carrying. There is no apology that reaches what happened to your people. I know that. What I can tell you is that. I have spoken to scientists who work in biological research, in the days before I left, and I asked them whether they understood what the Keth incident meant. I want to tell you what one of them said. She said, "It is the thing we are most afraid of." That is what she said. That the thing we are most afraid of, we did. And she wept when she said it. I watched her. She wept the way people weep when they understand something that cannot be unfelt. The Keth ambassador raised his head. He looked at her. His eyes, she had no reference for the quality of a Keth gaze, but she felt it land on her the way certain looks had always landed on her, the looks of people who had decided to listen despite themselves, the looks of children who had come into her classroom carrying something too heavy and were not sure yet whether she was safe. His eyes found her face and stayed there. Ruth did not look away. The next 48 hours were unlike anything Ruth had experienced, and she had experienced labor, the death of her husband, the loss of her classroom in a flooding event in 2063, and the particular specific exhaustion of a fever that lasts 3 weeks. 48 hours before the chamber, speaking and listening and speaking again, being questioned by prosecution representatives whose methods of interrogation ranged from the recognizably adversarial, the Velan prosecutor had a gift for the kind of question that contained its own hostile answer, to the genuinely alien, the Drelian method of examination being what Chorus translated as pressure through silence, which turned out to mean exactly what it sounded like and was, Ruth found. Something she had actually trained for, having waited out many silences in many classrooms. The Velan prosecutor, whose name translated, Chorus told her, as the one who holds the record, approached her on the second day with a mining incident and laid it out with the precision of a surgeon. The ecological surveys. The objections filed by the Velan Academy of Natural Study. The 47 written warnings issued through union channels. The approvals granted by the Corvin Corporations Board, all of them documented, all of them dated after the warnings. Your species received 47 formal warnings, the prosecutor said, its voice coming through the translation as something cool and exact, like a scalpel. 47. By your own legal conventions, 3 is considered sufficient notice. By ours, 1 is. 47 were ignored. How does your representative speak to this fact? Ruth had been waiting for this. Not because her team had prepared her for it, but because she had been a teacher and she knew the shape of the question that was also a verdict, the question that did not want an answer but a capitulation. I cannot speak to it as well as the families of those who filed the warnings could, she said. Some of them are still alive. I know several of their names. Theodora Vasquez filed Warning 14. She was a xenoecologist and she spent 6 years trying to stop what happened. She is 72 years old and she lives in Chile and she has given interviews about the moons consistently for 20 years and been mostly ignored by her own species. She paused. Humanity did not just fail you. We failed her. We failed the people inside our own civilization who tried to do right by yours. I think that's important to understand, not to excuse what happened, but to accurately characterize what kind of failure it was. It wasn't a failure of malice. It was a failure of structure, of who we listen to and who we don't, of how power moves inside our civilization and which voices get drowned out by it. She looked at the prosecutor. I'm not telling you the structure excuses the outcome. I'm telling you the structure is what has to change. And I can't promise you that it will, because I'm not in a position of power. I'm a retired schoolteacher. But I can tell you that I know what the failure looks like from inside it, because I have watched it happen on a smaller scale for 30 years, in the way my students' parents ignored the children who were being overlooked, and in the way institutions ignore inconvenient truth, and that is what I understand about why the warnings weren't heard. And I am ashamed of it. She said ashamed in her own language first, before the translation. She wasn't sure why. It seemed important that the word exist, somewhere in the record, in Yoruba, the way she actually felt it. The Velan prosecutor was still for a long moment. Then it said, and the translation came through with a quality chorus afterward described as the tone used for statements that are being reconsidered. You referenced an individual. Vasquez. Yes. She filed 14 of the 47 warnings? 14. Yes. This is in your species' public record? It is. I looked it up on the ship. The prosecutor consulted something at its station. Ruth waited. She was getting better at waiting. We were not aware, the prosecutor said, that the warnings had individual human authors. The filings in our record are attributed to institutions. They usually are, Ruth said. That's also part of the problem. On the evening of the second day, her second, the Union's calendar being its own animal, Chorus came to her quarters and said that 3 delegations had made private requests, the Velan, the Drelian, and a species called the Soreth whose name meant something like the ones who came back, which was a history Ruth had not had time to learn but planned to. The requests were all the same. Could they speak with her informally? Not as proceeding participants. As individuals. She said yes to all 3. The Velan representative who came, not the prosecutor, a different one, younger, with the quality of a person who has been watching very carefully from the side of a room, sat across from her and was quiet for a while and then said, through translation, that it had taught school. Ruth looked at it. It said that the Velan word for teacher translated approximately as the keeper of what survives, because in Velan history the teachers had been the ones who maintained knowledge through several extinction-level events, and that the role was considered one of the highest in their civilization. It said that it had not expected a teacher to come. Neither did I, Ruth said. The Drelian representative arrived with a gift, a small object that translated to a thing that holds time, which turned out to be a stone from a geological formation 300 million years old on its home world. It placed the stone in her hands and said nothing. Ruth understood that the saying nothing was the gift. The Soreth representative was the one that stayed longest. Its people had done something terrible 17,000 years ago in the Palavar system, Chorus had told her, and had been brought before a predecessor body to this union and had spoken for 3 days and been given, eventually, a conditional membership that had lasted 17,000 years without incident. It sat with her and it said, in the way of someone translating not just language but experience, the question they are actually asking is not whether your species is guilty. You are guilty. The question is whether your species is capable of understanding what guilty means. These are different questions. The first one has already been answered. Only you can answer the second. How did your people answer it? Ruth asked. The Soreth considered for a long time. Imperfectly, it said. We answered it imperfectly, and they could see that we meant it anyway. Meaning it matters more than getting it right. Getting it right comes later, if you mean it. Ruth sat with that. Then she said, I'm not sure I'm the right person to speak for 8 billion people. No one is, the Soroth said. That's what the lottery was for. The final session began at what the Union marked as the 72nd hour. Ruth had slept 4 hours again, eaten breakfast. The ship's food had been quietly adjusted over 4 days to match her preferences, which she chose to interpret as courtesy rather than surveillance, and sat with her notes for an hour before setting them aside entirely. She had known, since the Sorotha's visit, what the last thing she needed to say was. She had been circling it for 2 days. She was ready now to say it directly. The chamber was fuller than it had been. Species she had not seen in the tiers before had joined. Observer members, Chorus told her, civilizations not yet fully admitted to the Union but permitted to witness proceedings of significant weight. She looked out at faces she could not read, bodies shaped by evolution she could not imagine, eyes that had watched suns older than her solar system rise and set, and she felt the familiar specific feeling of standing in front of a classroom on the first day of a new year. The feeling that these people did not know her yet, and that what happened next would matter, and that there was nothing to do about any of it except begin. I want to close, Ruth said, by telling you about a child I once taught. The chamber held its textured silence. His name was Emeka. He was 8 years old. He was one of the brightest children I ever worked with. Genuinely, extraordinarily bright, the kind of child who understood things the first time and then understood why they were true, which is rarer. He was also a child who sometimes hurt other children. Not from cruelty. He moved through the world very fast, thinking very fast, wanting very much, and sometimes people got hurt in the movement of it. I had a conversation with him once, after an incident in which he had knocked another child down, genuinely accidentally. He was running, he was not looking, it was an accident, but the child he knocked down had broken her wrist, and Emeka understood very suddenly that his not meaning to hurt her did not change the fact that she was hurt. Ruth paused. The Keth ambassador was looking at her. Had been looking at her since she began. She held his gaze. I asked him what he was feeling, she said. He thought about it for a long time. He was that kind of child. He actually thought before he spoke, which made him unusual and also sometimes lonely, and he said, I feel like I should have been looking. And I said, yes. And he said, I feel like wanting good things doesn't mean good things happen. And I said, yes. And he said, I feel like I have to be slower. She stopped. He was 8 years old. He understood, at 8, what some civilizations take centuries to learn, and some never do. That the intention is not the outcome. That the speed of wanting is not the speed of understanding. That you can mean well and still leave a broken wrist behind you, and that both of those things are true at the same time. She looked away from the Keth ambassador. She looked at the chamber as a whole, at all of it, the compound eyes and the stone-still faces and the beings whose forms she couldn't hold in her visual field, all of them watching her, all of them here for the same reason, all of them waiting to know whether humanity was Emeka before the incident or Emeka after it. I cannot promise you that humanity will be slower, she said. I would be lying if I promised that. We are a young species and we are still learning what slowness costs us and what it saves. What I can tell you is that I believe we are capable of learning it. I have watched human beings learn things that seemed, from the outside, impossible to learn. I watched my students understand calculus at 12. I watched a man I loved die of a disease that had been incurable for 200 years and leave behind research notes that cured it. I watched my daughter, who at 17 had all the certainty of someone who has never been wrong, become a woman of 40 who apologizes when she should, even when it costs her something. We learn. We are slow and we are arrogant and we move too fast and we do not listen to the people in our own ranks who tell us to stop, and we learn. Not always. Not fast enough. But we learn. She collected herself. She was nearly at the end. I am not asking you to forgive the moons. I am not asking you to make the Keth whole, because I cannot make the Keth whole, no one can make the Keth whole. I am not asking you to forget what was done or to call it smaller than it was. I am asking you to decide whether a species that can produce an 8-year-old who says I feel like I should have been looking is worth keeping in the conversation. Because I think the conversation is what matters. I think whatever hope there is, for humanity, for your civilizations, for this galaxy, for whatever any of us is going to do with the time we have in it, is in the conversation. Not the shouting. The actual conversation. The kind where someone tells the truth and someone else listens. She paused for a long moment. She looked out at the 112 species and the observer galleries beyond them and the 400 million people on Earth watching through whatever screens they had found. "That's what I have to say," she said. "I'm sorry it isn't more." The vote was not instantaneous. Nothing about the Union moved quickly, which was, Ruth had come to understand, a deliberate philosophy rather than an inefficiency. The Drelian had proposed the current voting structure 4,000 years ago on the grounds that decisions made slowly tended to account for more of the truth than decisions made quickly, and the record bore this out. The 72-hour deliberation period that followed her closing statement was the shortest the Union permitted, and had been granted only because the prosecution's timeline had consumed most of the standard window. Ruth spent the deliberation on the ship. She slept more than she expected to. She called Adeyemi twice, once for practical reasons, once because she missed her daughter's voice. She sat in the observation lounge and watched space be itself, incandescent and enormous and indifferent, and found that the indifference was comforting in the way that very large things could be comforting to very small ones. Chorus brought her the result at what the ship systems marked as early morning on the fourth day. 112 member species. 63 in favor of continued membership, conditional on a new framework of accountability measures proposed by the Union's Oversight Council. 41 in favor of expulsion. 8 abstentions, which under Union rules counted as neither, and which Chorus told her included both the Soreth delegation and the species whose form she couldn't hold in her visual field, whose name translated as something like the ones who are still deciding, which she found, in the circumstances, entirely appropriate. 63. A clear majority, though not a comfortable one. She sat with the number for a while. Then she thought about Emeka, who was now 32 years old and worked in environmental remediation, who had sent her a message when the lottery result was announced that said simply, "Tell them the truth, Mrs. A. That's the only thing that works." She had written back, "I know." Outside the observation lounge, the stars were doing what they always did, burning, slowly, across spans of time that made human history a parenthesis in a sentence no one had finished writing. Ruth Adeyemi watched them for a long time. Then she went to make tea, because some things held their weight across all the distances in the world. She did not become famous, exactly, though the recordings circulated for years. She gave interviews for a while. She felt she owed people that, the willingness to keep talking, and then she retired from the interviews and went back to Lagos, and Adeyemi's youngest child started year 1 at a school not far from the house Ruth had lived in for 40 years, and she taught the child to read in the evenings, which was not a small thing. The accountability framework took 9 years to negotiate and was imperfect in the ways that negotiated things always were, but it held. The Velan ecologists who were assigned, under the framework, to work with human restoration specialists on the Corvin system damage reported, 11 years later, that 2 of the 3 moons showed early indicators of biological recovery. Slow, uncertain, not guaranteed, but present. Theodora Vasquez, who was 83 by then, gave a press interview from her home in Chile in which she said that this was not enough and was also more than she had expected, and she didn't know what to do with either of those things at once. Ruth read the interview and felt, for the first time in years, the exact particular quality of being understood across a distance by someone you have never met. The Keth ambassador, his name, she had eventually learned, translated approximately as he who carries the census, because he had spent his career preserving the count of those lost to the pathogen, sent her a message 18 months after the vote. It was brief. It said, in translation, "I did not want to hear you. I am glad I listened. That is all I have to say." She wrote back 3 words. She wrote, "It is enough." She was in her kitchen when she sent it, at the table where the papers had been spread out, on the Tuesday that had ended everything and begun everything else. The bougainvillea outside her window was doing what it always did, which was to bloom regardless of the circumstances, with the specific stubbornness of living things that have decided the world is difficult and that this is no reason not to flower. Ruth Adeyemi looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her red pen and went back to work. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience